All right, so I'm going to quickly review texturing our polygon surfaces inside of Maya. So we'll have 4 brief tutorials, each with a different form of a polygon, and we'll explore how we can map those textures to those particular kinds of surfaces. We'll start off with a sphere, much the same way we did with our network bug. So I'm going to select my polygon. I'll right-click and I'll choose Assign New Material. And I'm going to click on Lambert. So I'll do one of two things. Either I'll click up here to go to it as it appears here, or I could always right-click and go to Material Attributes, and I can access it that way. It's always a good idea to name these immediately, so I'll just call this Sphere. And then I'm going to go out, I'm going to put that checkerboard pattern. I've clicked on the checkerboard here at the end of the word color, that tab. And when the Create Render node comes up, I'm going to choose Checker. And sometimes you're going to get an error message here because Maya just gets confused, doesn't know quite what to do. So what I'll simply do is I'll go back, right-click on my sphere, choose Material Attributes, and once again I'll go back out and assign it. And if I've hit 6 on my keyboard, that checkerboard pattern will appear on my sphere. So I just want to map this on, and if you recall, I was trying to get that checkerboard pattern as close to a checker square as possible. So once I've applied it, I'm going to hold down my space bar, and I'm going to go to Create UVs. And you'll see the option to put on a spherical mapping. So I'm going to click on that. And when I do, it puts this virtual icon on my geometry. Now, I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard so you can see this a little bit more clearly. And you'll notice there are some red tabs here. So I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to close these 2 red tabs up next to each other. And all this means is that it's going to map my texture once around that sphere. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm going to hit 6. I'll click on my UV texture editor now, and now I'm going to go in and I'm going to refine those rectangular shapes. So you'll see that by default there are these icons, these virtual tools that allow me to go in, and now I can change the proportions of that checkerboard pattern till I get something pretty close to these squares. All right, now once I've done that, I'm still in my UV texture editor, obviously. I'm going to hit R to get my scale tool. And my next objective is to scale that down so that it fits inside that quadrant where the checkerboard resides. Let's try that. I'm going to scale it up just a little bit more. And I'll center it kind of like so. I'll go back to my object mode. I'll hit Command S to save. So it's not so much the size of those squares, it's that we squared it off first and then we minimize that pattern inside that upper quadrant where that reference rectangle or checker pattern shows. All right, so now with that object selected in its object mode, I'm ready to send this to Photoshop where I can make my texture. So what I'm going to do next is inside the texture editor, I'm going to go to Image, and I'm going to go down to Create PSD Network. And I'm going to check the size here, so it's 1028 by 1028. That's perfectly fine. Before I address any other element down here, I'm going to save this into my project folder. And I'm going to put this in the source image folder so that I can access this in Photoshop. And I'll call this sphere skin. And I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom of this network window, and I'm going to click on the word color, and then on this little tab to the right here, I'll click, and it puts that color attribute into the selector attributes. So now when I hit create, it creates a PSD that relates to this skin or this UV map that we have just sampled and put into the corner of the UV texture editor. So now we're all set to go into Photoshop and we'll build our texture and then we'll return to Maya. All right, I've opened up the PSD that was generated in Maya, and now I'm going to create a texture to wrap around that sphere. So if we take a look at the layer window, we'll see that there is a UV snapshot, and that is the UV mesh that we created when we applied the sphere texture to our geometry. And there's the checkerboard pattern that we put on by default inside of Maya to kind of get the proportions we wanted for the UV map. And at this point, it really is not necessary anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'll get my toolbar, and I'll hit D on the keyboard to make sure I've got black. And I'm just going to Option Delete Fill that so I can see that UV map a little bit more clearly. And you'll see some of these little indiscrepancies that we might deal with later on, but it's really nothing to be too concerned about at this point. The other thing you have to really be aware of is that when you start to develop your PSD network or texture inside of this PSD is that all the layers reside inside this folder that was generated by Maya. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in a texture that I've already made to apply to this map. So I'm going to copy this and I'll paste it. And there it is. It's above that blank black layer now and inside that folder. So I'm just going to kind of put this into position where I see that UV map, and I'll scale it accordingly pretty quickly here. And I want that blue area to go all the way across the base and around the whole sphere, so I'm going to kind of stop just short of it like so. And you get the hang of this as you start to play around inside of Photoshop and go back and forth from Maya to Photoshop. Now the only thing you really want to remember is that each time you make a change to your Photoshop file, you hit Command S to save. Otherwise, when we return to Maya and we go to that material attribute, and I'm going to go up to the top and I'll just name this sphere skin. And if I was to go to the right of that active text box, you'll see there's a box with a bit of a triangle. And if I click on that, the first option I get is to reload this texture. Now be sure to click on the reload, even if this appears before you do so, because some of you may have found out when you render out your animation, you may have seen it on your geometry, but Maya didn't understand the texture was actually on the geometry, and you get something black instead of that texture. So you can see now that that texture is on that sphere. Now I'm pretty good with that. Maybe I want to scale it differently, but I do want to turn off that UV map that I see when I render. That's that white line that was generated by the sphere UV texturizer. So I'm just going to jump back into Photoshop, and I'll turn off the UV snapshot here. I'll hit Command S again, and I'll return to Maya, and once again I'll proceed to the texture node, and I'll do two things. First of all, I'll reload it. Then I'm going to click on the box below the one that gave me this reload opportunity, and it takes me back to my proprietary node. It's something you want to be aware of in Photoshop on a Macintosh with Maya. Very often it brings in alpha information from those layers that you don't really want. So what I'll do is I'll right click and I'll choose Break Connection, and that'll assure me that if there are any black values or gray values here, they're not translucent when I generate my last renders. Okay, so you can see that's basically it.